around this time yesterday that Minister Becky Cele, along with KwaZulu-Natal Premier Sihle Zikalala, briefed the nation on law enforcement and social cohesion interventions in Phoenix, which was one of the worst affected suburbs of the recent unrest and violence. We learned how the death toll now stands at 36 just in Phoenix, and that 22 people have been arrested on various charges. Well, to talk more about this, we're joined by the director of the African Centre for Security and Intelligence, Praxis, Eldred de Klerk. Eldred, thank you as always for your time. I don't know about you, but when I watched the briefing, I felt that the police minister was a little thin on detail and was left scratching my head on what actual interventions on a safety and security level were going to take place.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to reflect on the recent events and specifically what the interventions in Phoenix. It is clear that whatever should happen there and whatever is going to happen there cannot happen without the full engagement and participation of all affected communities. It's Phoenix and its surrounding areas. And it needs to also involve local government, because what we see in Phoenix, I would say, is less than question of so-called race, because the notion of race is still a legacy of apartheid racist policies, and we still have the impact of apartheid spatial architecture. So the fact that there are people who felt threatened by a specific sector of our community, that needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be engaged. So we would hope that the minister, together with local government, actually starts to build a process of engagement, a process of deliberation, and a process of joint planning and interventions that can build trust, can build relationships in which people can feel heard, and that their stories can be told, and they can look to a shared future that's a lot more equitable and open and access opportunities for everyone.
Eldred, when we speak to people in the area, they say certainly on the surface there seemed to be social cohesion. People were marrying across races, people were working together quite happily, and then as soon as this tension came into the mix, it lit up like a tinderbox. Do you think more needs to be done from a social point of view, a social worker point of view, in terms of going in there and finding out what the root causes of the tension is?
Absolutely. Your contention as to the fact that this was always under the surface is true. We have to start addressing the deep-rooted structural, institutional, and cultural divides that exist, and the inequalities and power differential that exist. And this has now played itself out along class lines. I'm an anti-racist, so I don't buy the notion of the fact that we're all different races, and decidedly not because you can call somebody a race from the area of origin. So let me be clear and upfront about that. What I think we see is a question of class, and where so-called race has now embedded itself in economics, and the economics of the situation is clear for everyone to see. And this is the hard conversation that we have. Where is this South Africa for all, where everybody's quality of life, both materially and substantively, is different? How do we start building a shared identity? These are the critical questions that we need to be building, deliberating and building towards, so that we consider ourselves Africans, South Africans, and actually related to each other in so as far as that we need each other for the future.
Eldred, I agree with you on the wealth gap. As long as that inequality is so broad in the country as a whole, we're always going to have tension simmering below the surface. But at no point, interestingly for me, did the minister or the premier, Sihle Zikalala, mention Jacob Zuma, the ANC, or an attempted insurrection. Are the authorities avoiding a real problem here, or should we just ignore the fact of what could possibly have sparked the unrest that we saw?
Indeed, I think it's always difficult when we deal with this, with what's in front of us, and as in a series of sound bites. And you're absolutely right. We need to contextualize what happened. We need to consider where the impetus for this came from. And then we need to consider why were our folks so vulnerable and fearful of each other, because the narrative has been that there's an us and them, and you won't take away our president, and we will come out there and we will cause the country to be ungovernable. Let's root it in that narrative, and let's say that if we want to change that narrative and change that discourse, then it is something that we all have to consider. What does justice look like? Is it for everyone? Where do we go when it comes to municipal boundaries and divides? We're going into a local government election. Is it going to play itself out along so-called racist lines or racialized lines where people are divided and into specific groups? You're right, it's a hard conversation, and it's one that needs to be rooted in its genesis, and that is that there seems to be justice for some and not for others, different rules for some and not for others, and that the country owes some a debt and others not.
Aldred, lastly, and this is something that's been bothering me for a while, so feel free to say if you can't answer it, but we, just like you're talking about sound bites, we as a broadcaster can give you snapshots. So in all the footage coming in, we saw very few police on the ground. In fact, the ones that we did see were on their phones or they were just standing back. Where were all the police, in your view?
Well, I put this as a failure of what we call a strategic surprise. The police were overwhelmed. They didn't quite understand the capability of those who were involved, their intention or their commitment, and the scope and scale of this. So the fact that they felt overrun had to go back to the NatJoks. And what I think is we see a failure of public leadership from the whole of the security cluster, making sense of what's happening and then putting in place the necessary contingency to deal with it. And if you call the communities out to defend for themselves, then you have to take the consequences. You have to be prepared to address the consequences of that. So the police failed here. They dropped the ball. And it's okay to admit that. It's okay to say we can learn from this, and we will seek in the future just to do something different.
All right, Aldred de Klerk, a policing expert, thank you for your astute insight, as always.